Poland Riverside Cemetery Virtual Tour, Part 1. Hello, and welcome to our tour of this beautiful Riverside Cemetery. My name is Cook Fitch Kirtland, and I will tell you more about myself later. Over 150 years ago, in January of 1865, several Poland men got together at John Leslie's store. Now that's where the Wittenauer building is today. We talked about the need to have a monument in Poland for our Civil War dead and a burial place for others. Our earlier cemeteries were filling up. So I sent a letter to my friend, Governor David Todd of Youngstown, requesting a state permit to open a new cemetery. Well, by the beginning of 1865, the Poland Cemetery Association was formed. Dr. Truesdale donated the first 3 acres for the cemetery, and now it is over 30 acres with 7,000 names on various graves throughout the cemetery. I served as superintendent of this place for 32 years, so I know it pretty well. I am happy to see how well it has been preserved since my day. The cemetery board and Chris Nord and his crew, Brian and Skip, have done just a great job in keeping this final resting place so beautiful. Some of you may recognize this home. This is the home I built on Pittsburgh Road back in 1850. It was a beautiful home then and remains so today. What you see here are the minutes from the very first meeting. We met on January the 14th, a Saturday, at John Leslie's store. That's where the Wittenauer building is now. You can see in the top paragraph the names of all the Poland men who gathered there to talk about forming a cemetery. In the second paragraph, you see the names of the trustees who were elected at that meeting. T.W. Courtney was unanimously elected clerk. Afterwards were our bylaws for the governance of the association. Here is a map of Poland Riverside Cemetery. The dates inside the sections indicate the year that section was opened for burials. You'll see a red line around the very earliest section that was opened in 1865 at only 3 acres. Please follow me now as we begin our tour. We will start at the cemetery chapel, right near the parking lot at the front entrance to the cemetery. The chapel was built in 1973 in honor of Sergeant Howard Bruce Carpenter, who was killed in Vietnam. Members of the community donated funds for its construction. Names of the donors are listed on a bronze marker attached to the front of the building. Now here's the cemetery grave marker for Sergeant Carpenter. He was killed in 1967 at the age of 23. Not far behind the chapel is this mausoleum that holds the remains of Pete and Olive Mothy. Now, you may know that Pete Mothy was an industrialist, but did you know he played on the Penn State football team from 1909 to 1912 and served as their captain? The picture there below shows Pete with the S on his jersey. You're also, of course, familiar with this footbridge in the Poland woods. Pete Mothy donated the materials for that bridge in 1956 when he served as president of Youngstown Sheet and Tube. While we're in the area, I'd like to also show you the graves of Mothy's daughter, Bunty Stone, and her husband, John Stone. John Stone, of course, was very active in the community affairs of Poland. Now, this is the grave of Rachel Fowler Riley. She was the daughter of Jonathan and Lydia Kirtland Fowler. Her parents are buried in the old Poland Village graveyard near the Presbyterian Church. Now, notice Rachel's birth date, 1800. She was the first female child born in Poland Township. This is a possible location of the birthplace, not far down over the 224 bridge behind the home on Water Street. Of course, later on, she lived in this nice building known as the Old Stone Tavern, This is from a drawing produced by Chet Hunt. She married the town tailor, Thomas Riley. They had a home down on Pittsburgh Road area, somewhere in the area of Howell Drive, I believe. She had several children who were quite successful. One of the most imposing features in Poland Riverside Cemetery is this large Civil War monument. On October 21st, 1887, a large crowd of people gathered near the Poland Presbyterian Church. The schools had been closed, businesses were closed. This large group of people then paraded from the church over to the Riverside Cemetery. Now, I had the honor, as chairman of the Monument Committee, of unveiling the monument. After doing so, I then introduced the Honorable William McKinley, Jr. of Poland. He delivered an eloquent address paying a warm tribute to the heroic dead whose names were inscribed on the granite shaft. McKinley was a congressman at that time. On each side of the shaft is a roster of the dead of Poland with the places where they were killed or died from wounds in the Civil War. There are 39 names engraved on the monument. There are a total of 129 Civil War veterans buried in this cemetery, and of course, many from the different wars since then. You'll notice in the postcard here from an earlier day, there was a stack of cannonballs behind the monument. They are no longer there. The cannons were given to the cemetery by an anonymous donor. Now let's take a closer look at this side of the monument. You'll see the names of several of the missing veterans, and then at the bottom, it'll say William McKinley, Private Company E, 23rd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry. It has his birth and death date. Of course, he was assassinated in 1901. Then there is a mistake because it states he was both the 25th and 26th President of the United States. That's not true, and I have a hunch as to how that may have happened. Now we're going to show you information about two rather important men, both named James Kennedy. They actually were cousins. The first Kennedy was James B. Kennedy. He was born in Youngstown in 1863, but he was only 6 years old when both his father and mother passed away. He became a prosecuting attorney in Mahoning County in 1890, served for 6 years. In 1896, he became a judge of the Court of Common Pleas. He resigned that office in 1899 to go back into his law practice. In 1923, Judge Kennedy and his wife purchased Lot 11 of Poland Village, which we now know as 308 South Main Street or Poland Village Hall. In March of 1934, the Kennedys sold 5.5 acres of Lot 11 to the Poland Board of Education for the construction of Baird Mitchell Stadium. And they also sold 1.1 acres to Post 145 of the American Legion for their headquarters. The second James Kennedy was a U.S. congressman. That's the highest office of anyone buried in the cemetery here. He was the son of Thomas W. and Margaret Truesdale Kennedy. There's his picture there. He was also a lawyer, practiced in Youngstown. In 1903, he was elected as a Republican to the 58th Congress and to the next 3 succeeding Congresses. He served until 1911. He had grown up in the Kennedy home on Kennedy Road. He had 4 brothers who were rather accomplished engineers. I am always amused to see the marker for his daughter-in-law. Her name is inscribed as Florida Beach Kennedy. Now, while the McKinley family had moved from Poland to Canton, Ohio in 1867, 2 of the McKinley girls had married men from Poland. Here's the first one, Mary McKinley May. Unfortunately, she was rather sickly and died at the young age of 32. He married a man named Daniel May, and they lived in this home, which we now call the village pantry. It was at one time also the post office. But they operated a drugstore at this home and lived upstairs at that time. Now, there's an interesting book about Mary and her husband, Daniel May, and it's called Daniel and Mary, available at the Poland Library. But Daniel kept a diary of several years of his living in Poland, including many interactions with the McKinley family. William McKinley at times helped out at the drugstore owned by Daniel May. I always like the inscription on Mary's grave marker. It reads, "Why o'er the virtuous dead should mourners weep? The virtuous never truly die, they sleep." A second sister of William McKinley was Sarah, and she married a man named Andrew Jackson Duncan. Ironically, or maybe on purpose, their graves, as well as many other Duncans, are right near Duncan Drive. Now, Sarah and Andrew lived in the family home right next to Mary and Daniel's on South Main Street, but later on they moved to Pittsburgh and also to Cleveland, Ohio. Andrew Jackson Duncan, Sarah's husband, served in the same company and regiment as William McKinley, the Ohio 23rd. This large monument honors the Struthers family. Now you may ask, why is the Struthers family buried in Poland? And I believe some of you know that answer. There is no cemetery in Struthers. In fact, it may be the only city in Ohio without a cemetery. John Struthers bought the first 200 acres in Poland Township in 1799 from Turhant Kirtland. He built a furnace on Yellow Creek. When the War of 1812 began, he went off to the war, and unfortunately his business failed during that time. Others of the Struthers family are also buried here, including his two daughters, Emma and Drusilla. Now there's a tragic story about their death. They were attempting to cross the Mahoning River in a rowboat when the oarlock broke and they drowned. Well, here is my final resting place, along with many others of the Kirtland family. Altogether, there are some 31 Kirtland names on the various markers in this cemetery, mostly behind the speaker's rostrum. People ask how I got the name Cook Fitch Kirtland. It's such an unusual name. Well, I was named for my grandfather, Cook Fitch. Fitch was his last name. Sometimes I go by Cook, sometimes by Fitch, and sometimes just C.F. Kirtland. My father was Henry Kirtland. My mother was Thalia Fitch. They are buried here also. It makes me sad to say this, but my mother died right after I was born in 1826, when she was only 19. A couple years later, my father married her sister, Maria Fitch, so Maria became my mother. Now, even though Poland has always had excellent schools, my parents decided to send me back east to school. When I was 15, I was enrolled at the Cheshire School in Massachusetts. In 1849, several of we Poland men started hearing about gold being found in California. I'll tell you more about this later, but a group of us decided we wanted to go out and look for some of that gold. When we returned in 1850, I built this nice home on Pittsburgh Road. It was a beautiful home then and is now today. It was originally 72 acres, and I had other farms as well. I also was involved as president of Farmers Deposit Bank on your main street there. I was president of the Poland Seminary for many years, and I was elected to serve this area in Columbus as your state representative in 1873. Now, I did not actually serve in the Civil War, but I supported the troops and their families with finances. During my life, I traveled back to California twice and also toured the art and historic centers of Europe. I understand your historical society recently received my diary from 1873, in which I described that trip to Europe. When I was 24, I married Maria Swift. We had 3 children, but sadly, they all died fairly young. Maria died after 23 years of marriage, and then in 1876, I married her cousin, Hattie Swift. We had 2 children. Lucian was a journalist who traveled all over the world, writing about what he saw. And then my daughter, Isabel, married a fellow named George Bishop, and they lived in my house after my wife and I passed. Now, here's a picture of a group of Poland men who joined a club called the Robin Hood Club. My friend Ira Mansfield was actually the leader. You see him pictured in the back on the right, and you'll see a red circle around me standing in the back. We got involved in all kinds of things involving nature. Here you see us on a fishing trip in the nearby area. This large marker may be seen at the section of the cemetery near the Route 224 bridge. It was erected in 1915 by Ira Mansfield, as indicated in the photo. Robert Wilson served in the Mexican War. The inscription reads, "We killed more Mexicans with bayonet charges than with bullets." Because of his military experience, Wilson was named captain of Company H of the 105th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Many Poland men served in that company. At the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky in 1862, Wilson was shot 3 times and died. Ira Mansfield served in the same company and erected this monument years later in honor of his captain. The opposite side of the marker shows the names of 15 men who participated in a very long and hard trip across the country in 1849 to search for gold in California. I was among them, as was Captain Wilson. The trip was so difficult that only 8 of us actually returned. You can see the names on the list there. One who died was Ira Mansfield's grandfather, Elkanah Morse. He was an early settler and entrepreneur in Poland. Well, I was not around then, but I understand this gentleman was a well-known character to Poland residents in the second half of the last century. I understand he was known as the man on the spotted horse. His horse was called Rocky, and I know that he rode through the streets of Poland, through the Poland forest, and participated in every parade. In fact, I believe Rocky is buried in the Poland forest. He lived to be over 100 years old. The Grangers lived in Poland Manor. Now here are some slides just showing some of the beautiful scenes within Poland Riverside Cemetery. Here are some of our beautiful rhododendrons. The picture on the top right is the Morse rock. It was hauled out of Yellow Creek up into the graveyard around the Morse family graves. And you see in the bottom, yes, we do have trees in the cemetery. Occasionally, they fall. Just to the left of the entrance, you will see these 2 structures. Now, I learned something in preparing for this program. More than one columbarium is called columbaria, the Latin term. Our first columbarium was added in 2010, then 9 years later, 2019, the second one was added. There are 64 niches in each columbarium for a total of 128. 2 top pictures here show Yellow Creek at different seasons of the year. And the bottom pictures show you some older pictures of the Morse Bridge, also known as the White Bridge, and now we just call it Riverside Cemetery Bridge. Here are some recent winter scenes of the cemetery. All of the graves in this cemetery, with rare exception, and the other cemeteries in Poland, may be viewed on this website called findagrave.com. Normally you will see a photo of the grave marker, and then many will also show family relationships and biographical information. Here is a map of the grave sites we have visited, along with a key, should you wish to look for the graves yourself. Thank you for joining me on this Poland Historical Society production of Riverside Cemetery, Part 1. There will be a Part 2 in the future.